Hi, my name's Selena and today I am going to show you about the process of cyanotype making. Cyanotype is a very early and low-tech form of photography and uses solutions you can easily buy on the internet. And the great thing about cyanotype is that you can do it in natural light, most of it. There's a little few exceptions to that rule, but in general you don't need a darkroom setup, you don't need special lighting, you only need very simple equipment and materials. So I really enjoy it. It's great to do with various groups, and today I'm going to show you the simple method all the way through to the end. And I've got some examples of how it can be used. Now traditionally, and you'll see this a lot on Pinterest and lots of other sites, how it was the very first time it was used to document flora and fauna. So direct objects, and if you're familiar with the term of photograms or making photograms in a darkroom where you use photographic paper and light and the object in between, this process is very similar. So the paper would be coated. I'll show you the process later. I just wanted to show you some examples to show the various ways it can be used. And then, so using the coated paper, you can lay down natural found objects like flowers and leaves and bring it outside in the sunshine or in UV light. It's really important. That's the light source you need, is UV light. Leave it out there. In a sunny day, you're talking a few minutes. And a day like today in early spring, that we're in January now, it's up to 45 minutes, but it does work, which is great. So no additional equipment needed, just the sun, the sky, the light. So these would be kind of examples of very simple, the simplest form of photograms, laying down found objects or flowers and leaves. And the results can be really beautiful. You can frame them up to create these really beautiful little, shows the delicacy of the flower petals and the delicacy of various ferns and spiky leaves. It can be really, really effective. Another method I had done with a group was we made on acetate using found materials, mostly pasta really, and PVA glue. We made these butterflies. So these were on acetate first, laid them down on the cyanotype coated paper and exposed them, and we got these great butterflies. So another example, if you were using it with a group or in a classroom, or you just wanted to experiment in different ways. And then finally today, what I'd like to focus on is how to use your own negatives. Now a negative, like the negatives that would have come out of an old-fashioned camera at this stage, you would create them by printing on acetate. So acetate, which goes through an inkjet or a laser copier, and using your own imagery. So it can be images of personal images, photographs, copies of old photographs. Maps work really well. Anything really. It can, if you want a positive image, which is a photograph that's recognizable as a positive, you would reverse it and turn it into a negative. And you can do that really easily in Photoshop or even in Paint. You reverse the image so it looks like a negative. That will give you a positive, but equally using the positives, like just printing straight onto acetate, gives you really interesting effects because it'll give you a negative in your image. This will all become more apparent as you experiment and play. So these are a few examples. So this is an example. We're in Derry and with a group working with imagery from Derry. So if you're from Derry, this imagery might be familiar. If you're not, this is local to the Derry area. So we have some maps of the River Foyle, some of the murals from the bog side, and some buildings that would be familiar to those that know the town. And then they've been collaged together, so you can see there's some layering going on, and because they're acetate, it works really well by layering. Using a straight negative to create a negative, you can create photographs, so you can create a photographic image using this process also. So I'm going to go through the process of how we coat the paper, set up an image, get it outside and rinse it. Very, very simple, but really, really effective. And then what I'd like for anyone watching this is to go and experiment. There's so many different ways you can experiment with this process. As I say, all you need is sunlight or light. I would say sunlight if we were in a great warm sunny country, but UV light, that's really important. So what you're going to need, and the most important is you're going to need your cyanotype chemicals. I do want to just point out, there is an alternative. You can buy pre-coated paper, and it comes, there's some limitations though, and mostly it's size. This is the one that I have found. It does work, it's grand, but the cost, it's really expensive for what it is. It gives you very small images, but if you want to kind of grab and go, this is what you can order. So it's this Sunprint paper. The larger it gets, the more expensive it gets. So I would suggest you make your own, but that is available. Now, the more traditional and the method that I use that goes a really long way is to get on the internet, on Amazon, on many sites, you can get a Cyanotype kit. And what it is it comes in two. Now you can get dry powders, but I use the liquid form because it's really easy. I don't have to get into mixing up dry chemicals. This comes 2 bottles of the pre-mixed chemicals, and they are mixed together in equal parts. So what we're going to do is, and you're going to need some sort of a measuring jug. We're going to make equal parts of this. Let me go through what else you're going to need. So a small measuring jug or a container that you can create equal amounts of these liquids into another container. You're going to need some sort of mechanism of getting the liquid onto the paper. So I'm going to show you using a sponge, an applicator, and just a nice soft brush. Obviously you're going to need some sort of material that you're going to coat. I'm just going to use normal paper. If you look on the internet, they do, if you get really into cyanotype, it starts to talk, people get really into it and start talking about the acidity of the paper and using very expensive papers. And I found that when you're working on it like this or experimenting, any watercolor paper is equally good. It works really well. So I've got a simple watercolor pad. So that's what we use. I think this weight is 190 gram paper. Very cheap and cheerful watercolor paper. The other thing that's really handy is a couple of bulldog clips and a clip frame. Now, a couple of £1. These are really cheap. Take everything out. You don't need the mat or the mount, just the glass and the backing card. 2 bulldog clips to get together. This will create our sandwich of cyanotype paper, negatives, and then the glass and the card in between that'll go outside. So really useful. And then of course some sort of receptacle. These are old trays from the darkroom, but any real receptacle that you can paint. You could cover your table with a waterproof paper. It's up to you, but when this is mixed, it's yellow, but it will go bright blue in the sun, so you don't want to get it on clothes or anything that it won't wash out. And then of course, last thing is negatives. Or negatives or positives, acetates, things you have printed onto acetate. So I have multiple images here. And that's us. When you accumulate all of these things, not really a lot, we're ready to go. So just to explain the process of mixing the solutions, the 2 solutions, and then coating it. So using anything that has a small container that you can dose out equal amounts. So I use these little jam jars. I recycle everything, as many things as I can, and these are little jam jars from a cafe. So I'm going to take the first solution A. Doesn't really matter whether you put A in first or B. Ferric ammonium citrate. So we'll take just up to the lip, put that in, put the lid back on it. And then solution B, they're going to mix anyway, so we don't need to rinse this out. And this is the potassium ferric cyanide. Sounds scary, but I don't think you need to be worried about it. If you want, you can put on gloves when you're doing this, because as I say, it's bright yellow now, but when the sun hits it and when they're mixed, it will go a deep blue. Now, ideally, I am doing this in light, with UV light coming in the windows. Ideally, I have to say, I would do this at nighttime. And I would suggest that you do this at nighttime when the UV light is no longer about, when it's dark, because the UV light is what affects this. So it's great in a classroom. If you're in a classroom and you don't have many windows and you have phosphorescent lights or any other lighting, will not affect it because it's UV light. So this is not ideal, but I just wanted to be able to show you and film it at the same time. Ideally, do this at night, do this stage, coat the paper, leave them to dry overnight, and then you're ready to go next day. So we've got our solution, we've got it mixed together. It does change, it's getting darker, and it probably will get a little darker while we're sitting in the sunlight, but I'm going to do this really quickly. So either you have a waterproof covering on your desk, or you use something that you can, it'll pick up any spills because it will run, it's very liquid. You want to coat this paper, and you can see that it goes, let's move this, and get a nice even coat. Now usually I coat the entire paper, so I have an entire A3, A4 sheet that I can use then to put my negatives on, but sometimes people like to see the brush marks and be more painterly with their approach of how they put this solution on. So that is coated, so I would want to now put this in the dark somewhere, or in a room that you can darken, and put it away overnight. Ideally, as I say, do this at nighttime. You can be more painterly with your approach and leave the brush strokes and leave it like this, and see if that's something you like. But what I want to point out is I wouldn't leave these now sitting out in daylight drying. You really can't do that. I'll stress again, I know I'm repeating myself, but I would do it at nighttime, leave them in a dark room. You can use a hairdryer, but I found that can be a little bit tricky. So I usually just, as I say, leave them overnight in a darkened room and go back in and stack them then, because they may have curled a little as they dry. Stack them under a book. And how you're going to want to store them, you're going to want to store them in black plastic. So you'd make yourself a pouch of thick black plastic, or several layers of bin bags, like a pouch that you can put them inside, because you can do several of these and keep them for a few weeks, so long as they're in the dark and they're not, as I say, being affected by UV light. So this is simply how to coat. You can use, as I say, the sponge applicator is very simple as well. So if I'll just show you very quickly. Sponge applicator gives you really nice, smooth. It's actually much easier to control and coat, especially an entire page. And as I say, this solution will really go a long way. You can see just how much or how little it takes to coat one sheet of paper. So out of that solution we have mixed with that two little jam jars worth, I'd say you would get at least 10 sheets of paper, at least 10 sheets of A4 watercolor paper coated. So you can see that gives you a nice smooth surface. Again, I take it out of the pad and let it dry. This is the step one, your preparation. Do this ahead of time. Don't do this on the same day you want to do your cyanotypes. Better to be prepared with this stage beforehand. So your paper is coated. You've let it dry overnight, which is the ideal situation. And just wanted to show you what I would store my coated paper in. And you can coat multiple, in fact, I would suggest you coat multiple sheets of paper, because once you've made your solution, you can't really keep it. So it's best to use it all up entirely, coat as much paper. Now remember, I'm using watercolor paper, but I have seen it. You can use old books, old pages from books, anything really that's absorbent. You can do it onto material, on cotton material, but I found that's very tricky to coat and find somewhere to let it dry overnight without staining everywhere. I want to be very clear about this, that it's yellow now. It looks quite benign, but once the sun has hit it for a few hours, it goes a very beautiful, but a very denim dark blue, and it will stain. It'll stain clothes, and it'll stain surfaces. So that's, be pre-warned, please. And experiment. I'm just sticking with watercolor paper. I think it's a good way to start. As I said before, I make a package of really thick plastic, black plastic. I also have a bag from a darkroom that's really super light tight. But if you can make a double, treble, even quadruple thickness package out of black plastic, that should work. I also have coated some and made this this is super secure, 2 thin sheets of plywood. I've sealed it with duct tape. I can access it through here. This is really light tight as well, so anything that works to keep light out. So we've coated our paper. Now at this stage, if you work, you can work in daylight. What I would suggest you do is, if you're doing an A4, is to use a simple sheet of A4 uncoated paper to work on. I'm just going to pop this down out of the way a second. An uncoated simple sheet, just so that you can see what you're doing. And then it really is a case of playing around with your acetates or whatever, we'll call them acetates or negatives. Again, they could be negatives or positives. Some of these are negative images, so they will come out as a positive. They look correct. And some are positives, so they were directly photocopied onto acetate, so they look correct on the acetate, but they'll be in reverse. But it's all good. They all really work well because the image still comes out. It's actually really interesting because when you have negatives of, say, a cityscape, it almost looks like an x-ray of the city. I love negatives of the city. So I've used some imagery, again, using the Derry imagery that I have, an oak leaf. So if you can see here, I like to use a compass just when we're doing mapping a city or a cityscape. This is a detail from the walls. Derry's a walled city, as many of you I'm sure will know. And these are some details from the gates in the city. Some maps, some really old ancient vintage maps of the walled city. And again, you can put text in, you can Sharpie it, so you can use a permanent marker, and you can also draw onto acetate and make a photograph that way, but you can use these kind of letters that are printed. You can get these in craft stores. And the oak leaf, which is one of the symbols of Derry, and again, a picture of the wall. So I've kind of assembled them on the paper in daylight because you might want to take a little bit of time. You might want to, as I say, cut your negatives up. You might want to be quite detailed and cut the river out. And this one, a map of the river, you might want to be very detailed. You might want to take a long time collaging, working on your collage. And I would not suggest, do not do this on your treated paper. So I've created a little, just very few images. There's like 4 or 5 pieces on this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lift my glass plate. I'm going to put it on top. And then I'm going to slide the whole thing. And I'm going to I'll try and flip this over. Just so that I can lift the backboard, lift my white paper out of the way. Some things will have moved. I'm not going to worry too much, but this now gives me an idea of where I'm going to place it on my treated paper. So at the next stage, we'll get the treated paper out of our sealed bag or wherever you're keeping it securely. We'll assemble the acetates onto it. We'll clip them together, create our sandwich, and we're ready to get it out into the sunlight, or the light, I should say. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get me right.
Perfect.
Okay, so we have made our sandwich of the board, the acetate, our paper, our Cyanotype paper, the acetates that you've arranged the way you want them, and then the glass. Finally, it's very important with the bulldog clips. Now try and keep the bulldog clips right on the edge because they are going to create a shape. They're going to obviously change your collage, so keep them to a minimum, their impact to a minimum. And this is going to rapidly change from that bright yellow, it's already changing, to a kind of a green. It'll go right through in color. Now on a day like today, we're in January, I'm setting a timer for 45 minutes. It's quite a long time, but it's worth it if we want to get a good contrasty print. On a really bright, in the middle of summer, on these glorious summer days that we have in Ireland, it can come right down to a minute or two, and that's just a case of experiment. The more you do this, the more you'll get used to it. But to be honest, I'm just delighted that even on a dull-ish day, because we have UV light and we're heading into spring, it does work. So I'm going to leave this one here. I'm going to take this one that I put out earlier. This has been out for about 45 minutes and you can see it's completely changed. Now this paper was older paper I had coated. It wasn't as bright yellow, it was slightly green. But we'll take it inside and we'll have a look and see what impact the 45 minutes of light has had with our negatives and our sandwich being outside for that time. We'll take it inside, have a look, and we'll rinse it and see if we get a Cyanotype print. So we've come back inside. We have our sandwich still here. We're going to get ready to rinse it, which is how we get the image to appear. Just a little bit. I'm doing this in a photographic tray that I have, but equally you can do this in a sink. In fact, ideally you would do it in a stainless steel sink or at a sink or in a bath. Again though, will stain, so you will have to, there will be cleanup afterwards. So if you have an old container, or what I've used in the past in groups, with groups, is to use a box, like a clear box that you have for storage. That can work really well because you can do it outside. But basically water, what I found is I really did a lot of cyanotypes when I was on residency in the States, and over there they use, and you'll see on the internet they say to use hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide with the water brings up the blues really quickly. Now they will, if you read up about cyanotype, the process, the image continues to develop. It continues to oxidize, and the blues, they say the blues come up over time. You can fast track that by adding hydrogen peroxide to the water, and it works really quickly. Now we can't get hydrogen peroxide the way you can in the States. So I've tried everything. What I have found works is like sort of like a bleach solution. And I found that this sterilizing solution, like Milton Fluids, something like that, it's quite a bleachy smell, so it's obviously in the bleach family. I just add a little capful to the water, just a little bit, not much, okay? Because it can have the opposite effect of bleaching out your image, and you don't want that to happen. So we're going to uncover our sandwich. We're going to unsandwich it. Bulldog clips off, glass off. Now what we're looking for is an effect that the light has had, and you can see, if you look at that up close, you can see that there's a faint image of our negatives. Okay, so into the water, and we're going to, just like you would in a darkroom. Now ideally you would be doing this in a sink, because as you can imagine it can get quite messy. What's going to happen is that yellowness, that's what you want to wash out. So, and you know, sometimes it can be better with running water, but this should work. And they will say that you should rinse your prints for at least 10 minutes. What I tend to do is I rinse it in this solution and then I would change the water. But as I say, working with larger groups, we have used the same water for multiple prints, so you don't need to constantly change this. Don't like one-time use of anything, so let's reuse it as much as we can until it stops working, basically. So you can see that has worked really well, like in a darkroom, but again, without having to have those darkroom conditions, you can create a photographic image without any of the equipment, without any of the specialist lighting, papers required. Really, you just need the Cyanotype kit. And as I will stress from before, a little goes a long way. So you can see it's a really effective, whether it's a straight image, a straight copy. The only limitation that you're working with here is the blue. It is a cyanotype. Cyan, as we know, is a color, as a form of blue. So I personally love them. It's where the term blueprint comes from. This process is what was used to make blueprints in architectural practices. So I love the different colors of denim blue. There are methods online, if you get really into this, where you can tone them different colors. You can make it a black and white image by bleaching it out and staining with tea and coffee. And it's something I've never really got into, but if it interests you, that idea of changing the color from blue to traditional black and white, you can experiment. But I just love the different tones of blue, and this one has worked really well. So this now, I would rinse again. There's a little bit of yellow still here. And so I would keep rinsing. Ideally, you really want the nice blue and white. You want the white of the paper to come back. So I would keep rinsing this because there's a kind of stain of yellow here. So again, I would rinse this in clean water, running water, for a good while, or fill a sink with water if you don't want to leave the tap running, and just give it a good rinse as many times to try and get rid of the yellowness. But really, that's our print. A few things I want to point out. It's really important you use the glass on top, because if the sandwich is not tight, you will get, the way this is lovely and nicely in focus, and you can read the text, and as you can see, some are positives and some are negatives. So where the sky is dark when it should be white, this is obviously was a positive and now is a negative image, but there are some positives in there. So the road here is now positive because it was a negative. And then of course maps work really well because they're so graphic. You need the sandwich though, because if you don't have that tight sandwich with the bulldog clips, things can go in and out of focus. Now sometimes that's a nice effect, but if you want the text and a really crisp image, make sure it's a tight sandwich. So at this stage, I'm ready to really put this aside and rinse it and get going and make some more. We will wait for the one we set up earlier, and we'll rinse that, see how the text shows up. And really, that's it. This now needs to be taken out, as I say, rinsed, dried. And because it's watercolor paper, it probably will, because you're totally submerging it, it will curl up. But you know, that's easily remedied by putting under several heavy books for a couple of days. And you'll have a really beautiful print that you can then cut up, recollage again, or frame, mat out certain areas. But a really effective technique. Could be a beautiful patchwork to make it really more abstract, or it could traditionally be more of just a cyanotype straight print. It's up to you. Go experiment.